Hi everyone, this is video 17, and today we're going to be going over more object-oriented programming, kind of reviewing the stuff we talked about last time, and also introducing some new concepts, and then we're also going to be talking about this idea called representation. So, very exciting stuff. So, the first thing I'm going to talk about is calling methods using the class versus the object. We briefly touched on calling methods using the object, but one thing we haven't really talked about is calling methods using the class. And I think the best way to show this is to just look at our car class and see how we do this using the terminal. So I'm going to run Python. And so now, as always, we first need to construct an object. And the way we do that is with a constructor. And so once we have the object, so here's our Tesla object. One thing we can do with this object is we can, of course, get attributes and all that stuff, which we talked about last time. And then we also talked about how we can use it to call methods. And remember, we don't have to pass in self because self is instantly bound to Tesla or whatever object we called it with. So in this case, we called it with the object Tesla. So self is immediately bound to Tesla. But one way we can also use methods basically to create or call methods is using the class. So the way we can do this is we can have car.drive, and now in this case it's a little different because we're using the class to call the method, not the object. So there's a very subtle difference here. But what we can do now is we have to basically pass in something to self now because there's nothing for self to be bound to. There's no object for self to be bound to. So to do this, we can just pass in the object we want to drive, and that's going to be Tesla, and then we can pass in how many miles we want to, or gallons we used. And then if we look at tesla.gas, it should be 5 because we used 15 gallons of gas. So that's the basic idea of how the class, using the class to call the method works versus using the object to call the method. Alright, now the next part of this video is going to be talking a little bit about representation, and the motivating question for representation is how do classes quote-unquote know how they should be represented or printed. So in this example right here, we have a class called fraction that we imported, and then we create a half. But when we basically evaluate half, how does half know that it should represent itself like this? And then better yet, if we print half, how does it know that it's actually represented as 1/2? Like how does the computer know that? So that's the key question we're going to ask today. And as you can see from our Tesla class, our Tesla object using our car class, we haven't really talked about this because when we get Tesla, we don't really get anything useful at all. So right now what we have is this, and this is not very helpful at all. So we want to find a way to make it a little more helpful. So one way we can do that is have Tesla return the actual constructor that we used to create this. And then, this is actually not the actual constructor, sorry, I misspoke. It's more a representation of how we should represent that object, so within the computer. Then if we want to print Tesla, we'll have a more succinct version, just calling it the black Tesla. So I'm just going to go through how we implement this, and to implement this, we have to use two special methods within classes. One is called the repr method, and so what the repr method does is actually quite intuitively, it tells basically the class how should I represent myself. Okay, and so with the repr method, we're going to get this first line. Okay, this first line is basically made using the repr method, so implicitly called, by the way. And so we want to get car parentheses. So let's do that. We basically the repr method is always going to return a string. So we're going to have car parentheses, and then we're going to have what the model first, self.model, and then we're going to have a comma. And then it's going to be followed by the color. And then, of course, we're going to close parentheses. So this gives the class a representation of how it should display itself when evaluated. So an object of the class, when it's evaluated, will automatically call the repr method. And one question you might have is, hey, what are these special underline things that we put in here? And it's also shown in the init method. I won't talk about why it's in the init method, but in the repr method, one of the reasons it is because repr is actually a built-in function in Python. And what we're telling this class to do is, hey, I'm going to override that built-in function because I'm going to give you this definition, and I want you to use this definition whenever I have a reason to represent this object. So now with this, let's see how this works. So I'm going to save this file, and I'm going to run Python again. And what I want to do is I'm going to, again, have Tesla. And then now, if I evaluate Tesla, previously we got this garbage. But now, I get a very nice representation of Tesla. And this is, again, because of how we define the repr method. So if we actually call repr on Tesla, so remember, repr is a built-in function, and we just basically overrid the entire function, we're going to get this. And then what it displays into the interpreter is the printed version of this. So this is an important concept to understand and how this works. So this is what's actually displayed when we call Tesla. Okay? Now, also one quick thing to note also is that if we want to do, we can also call the method directly like this. But this is a little more lengthy, so I personally prefer just calling it using the function. They're basically the same thing. So just to make sure we understand that. And now let's try out print Tesla. This won't actually work the way we want to because we haven't implemented the second method. So when print Tesla is going to do, it's going to first check for a stir method. So what's the stir method? Well, it's another built-in function in Python that represents how things should display itself in a human readable format, basically. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but right now, it doesn't have a stir method, so it's going to just have the same representation that the repr method has. So that's its default. But now, we're going to define a stir method, and we want to get the color followed by a space followed by the model, black Tesla. So that's the whole idea here. And so now if we do this, the real magic's going to happen because now we can represent and print the Tesla. Oops, I need to first define it. Tesla gives me that, and if I print Tesla, hold on, right here, if I print it, I'm going to get black Tesla. And again, this is because it's implicitly calling these built-in functions. So let's talk a little bit more about this whole program. So again, Tesla gives us Tesla black because that's how we defined it in the repr method, and when we print Tesla, it implicitly calls the stir method, so we'll basically override that and say, hey, I want it to display in this format. So let's talk about internally what exactly the repr function and stir function do. So the repr function returns a Python string that basically represents the object. So it's more of a computer representation rather than a human representation. Personally, I think as a human, we appreciate the half version rather than this lengthy version, but in terms of what it is in the computer, this is more of an accurate representation of that. So that's why the repr function is usually used to get a more computer representation of the text, or basically the object. Now the stir function returns a human-friendly string, and that conveys basically the meaning of the object. And so this is general guidelines on how to do it. We can actually define the repr and string to be however we want, but this is generally how you want to do it if you're actually building a large-scale program and you want to have some way to represent how your object should print out and be represented. So, and also a really, really important concept is the result of calling the stir function is what Python prints when we use a print function. So implicitly, for example, let's just look at an example. So whenever we have a string like hello, we've been printing that string and we haven't really talked about how this works. Okay? But what actually happens is the string is going to call its stir method. Okay? And so that's going to give us this. And if we print that, we strip away the quotes basically, we're going to get our representation. Oh, oops, I put one extra underline. We're going to get basically our call to print. And so also an interesting thing with strings, so we have a string hello. If we ask how is the string represented, what the program is going to do, it's basically put around quotes how it represents the program. So it puts in double quotes, hey, this is a string hello. So it's a little confusing in how repr works, but the repr is just saying, hey, around quotes is how I represent this program. So, and of course, the string is just represented as a string. So that's how we can think about the repr function. Okay, and also note that there is no difference between calling repr like this or using the built-in method, or the method we overrode. So don't get confused by this.